In this video, we're going to be talking about what causes gold to drop out of the flow in a creek, river, or sluice. And if you've seen any of my other videos, you'll know it's got absolutely nothing to do with pressure. So today we're filming at the Lightning Hill mine, and I'm hoping the shelter amongst the footings of the old mine machinery is going to protect us from the wind. G'day, my name's Stuart Chignell and welcome to Mad Scientist Prospecting, episode 7 of the fluid dynamics of prospecting, and this is where we are really getting to the pointy end. All the other stuff that we've covered is to get to this point, to start talking about the mechanisms that cause gold to be deposited and where. If you've been with us from the beginning, thanks for your patience. If you're just joining us, some of the stuff I'm going through might not make sense because you haven't seen the other videos where I was coming to more of the basic stuff. So see how you go, but if it's not making sense, maybe jump back and check those other videos out. I finished the last video talking about what causes gold to be picked up in the first place. The two action forces of the impulse of the water wanting to knock the particle on, and the friction of the water moving past the particle and dragging on the surfaces wanting to get it moving. Countered by the reaction force, which was the friction between the particle itself and the surface on which it was resting. As I said in the last video, it's almost never that a particle will stop because it contacts a solid surface and then the reaction force of the friction between the particle and the surface can re-establish itself and stop the particle. So what does cause the particles to stop? Well, when you've got full turbulent flow, the churning of the water is so great that there are no velocity gradients, there are no distribution gradients of particles, everything is just being thrown around, up and down. In that sort of environment, gravity is a relatively weak force and is completely overpowered by the churning and the mixing forces of the turbulent flow. Now, as friction begins to exert itself on the flowing water, it's stripping energy from the flow, depleting the flow of energy. And as it does so, there's a layer of water, a region of water around the outside of the flow. The water that's in contact with the sides and the bottom of the channel. The friction between that water and those solid surfaces slows that water down. But then that region of water is now moving slower, and so you get a friction force developing between that slow moving water and the next layer in. And because friction is so dependent upon velocity, that velocity differential creates further friction, so you get another layer developing in, and each subsequent layer is exerting roughly the same amount of friction, but because of velocity differentials Whoa. All you need to tell them is that laminar flow is set up by friction, that there are a series of layers moving at different speeds, and that the slow moving layers tend to be towards the outside and the bottom, faster moving layers towards the center and the top. That's it. Last time we did a video like this, you were telling me off for not going into enough detail. Yeah, I was, but yeah, now you're doing it wrong in a different way. Right. Where was I? The mechanism for what actually causes particles to stop is very like throwing a rock across a pond. Do you realize how hard it is to film a rock skipping across the water? It's tough, but I finally worked out how to do it. Now, you piff that rock, you impart all this energy into it as you throw it. If you get the angle right, and if you impart enough energy in the throw, you give it enough speed, then it will hit the water and bounce. But then a little while on, it'll come down and touch the water again. And when it does, it's going to lose energy through friction between the rock and the water. So that when it bounces again, if it's still got sufficient energy to do so, the distance that it travels before the next bounce is a lot less. And if it does it again, the distance is going to be less until it stops and it sinks. That is exactly how particles are stopped in a flow. It's just that when you throw the rock, you give it all its energy and that's it. But a particle in a stream, it can constantly have its energy renewed by the flow. So it's a little bit more complicated. When you've got a particle drifting down through gravity in lamellar flow, the particle will continue to come down and it will touch that layer, that interface between the layers, the fast moving water and the slow moving water. And when it does, almost certainly it's going to bounce. But when it bounces, it's going to have lost some energy. And because the slower moving water is a liquid, and because the particle is a solid, the particle makes an impression in that slow moving layer. And in making an impression, you actually get quite a large contact area between the slow moving water and the particle, which means relatively a large amount of friction, which means the particle loses relatively a large amount of energy. It still bounces. And as soon as it bounces, as soon as it loses contact with that slow moving water, it's immediately being re-accelerated by the fast moving water. Now, at this point, two things can happen. The speed of the fast moving water can be such that it just re-accelerates the particle and it touches down again and then touches down again and touches down again. And every single time it touches down again, it bounces, its energy is renewed and it just keeps on moving. But if the overall energy of the flow is such that the fast moving water is not able to replace the energy that the particle has lost before it touches down again, then it loses even more energy. And then the next time it touches down is going to be a shorter distance downstream, and then a shorter distance downstream, and then a shorter distance downstream. But once they hit that bottom layer, once they're rolling along the surface of the channel, there's still nowhere near enough friction between the particles and the solid surfaces to get them to stop. Not unless the energy of the flow drastically drops away. And in creeks, rivers, and sluices, there's another mechanism that comes into play which works much more effectively. It's only in things like gutters and culverts and canals and stuff that you really see particles stopping because they just stop on the surface of the bottom of the channel or whatever. Just doing the final cut on this video, and I thought of another example where that can happen even in natural channels, and that's where the sides of the channel open up very quickly. Like for example, when a creek is leaving an erosion gully or a river's leaving a gorge, suddenly the water's got a lot more room to move, the velocity drops, and all the material starts falling out of the flow very, very, very quickly. Anyway, normally when I'm doing simple examples, I like to talk about a sluice because sluices are simple, but for this, we want to talk about a river with a bar of bedrock going perpendicular across it. Now we have a bar of bedrock, and we've got the surface of the river. I hope you guys can see this. All right, and we've got the flow. Now this obstruction, here's the top of the flow, creates some really fast moving water. And here we get this area of really slow moving water. And that area of slow moving water is quite huge, it's quite big. And it sort of tails off. And then as the friction between the fast moving water and the slow moving water sort of begins to exert itself, this velocity differential dissipates, this sharp velocity differential dissipates, and you get back to more regular lamellar flow downstream, unless of course there's another obstruction. Very hard to see this in a river, but it's very easy to see it if you're just talking about, say, a boulder. And in other videos I've shown you that sort of teardrop shape of slack water behind a rock by muddying the water. And you can see when the water changes from clear to muddy, that slack water, you know, reveal itself. Now this area is often mistakenly called a low pressure area or a low pressure zone. In fact, this is the low pressure zone, just that little area at the top, just behind the obstruction. This area isn't low pressure, is it? No. Do not go there. If you start trying to tell them that that is in fact a high pressure area, you're just going to confuse them. Hang on, you just told them it... Yeah, okay, I did. Right. At another point, another time, do a video on Bernoulli's theorems and the Bernoulli equations and explain it in detail. But don't have time now, okay? Okay, moving on. Alright. Now let's say we got a particle that's trundling along here. And it doesn't do it, the low pressure zone doesn't do anything to the particle at all, nothing. And the particle, say, is traveling and it touches here, loses energy, bounces. Now if this flow is fast enough, the particle will, as I said before, will just carry on through. It'll bounce, reaccelerate, carry on. But if this isn't fast enough and this particle touches down and then touches down, oh, hang on, no. Touches down, and then whoop. Here, it basically sinks and comes to rest. Basically. I know there's all sorts of complicated currents and stuff going on here, but basically that's what happens. Now the low pressure model predicts that gold will be affected by the low pressure zone, will drop out behind the flow, and the best place to look for the gold is you know, here. That means there's an awful lot of examples, an awful lot of obstructions in creeks and rivers where for a considerable distance downstream there's an area which could have a reasonable concentration of gold, but almost no one is digging it. Now a particle that falls out and sort of just sinks to the bottom here in this area is very vulnerable to being moved on again if the regime reverts to turbulent flow. Because in turbulent flow, everything gets picked up and chucked around. So a particle just sitting here, if turbulent flow comes in again, it can get picked up and thrown around. Now for you guys living, prospecting in rivers where turbulent flow is a regular thing, this isn't going to be a good place for you guys to look. Like for example, Dan Hurd in Canada, Gary Two Toes, I think he's in California, Pioneer Pauly, you guys all have the spring melt, and it means that almost every single year you get massive flows, massive turbulence, and so you're unlikely to find gold collecting over the years in this area. Here in Australia though, completely different. Here in the Whipstick, it is dry as a chip almost all the time. We haven't really had a turbulent flow event since 2010, 2011. Anyway, long bloody time, doesn't happen every single year. Chris from Vogus Prospecting, working up around the Beechworth area, he gets the flow from the high country, so some of the creeks he's working in would get regular turbulent flow every year, others wouldn't. It's one of the reasons why it's important to know the character of the creek to work out where the particles go. So, Australians, this is a really good spot that I think that people haven't been teaching you to dig. I've got some really good results finding pickers in this zone, as well as, you know, fine gold. But what happens if the particle goes bloop, 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 and gets into here? Well, roughly proportional to the height of the obstruction, there is a current forms here. And the friction of this water here interacts with this water here and moves it that way. And that is like, say that's a wheel, center of it here, and it's like tap, 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 getting the wheel to spin.
That wasn't supposed to happen.
And so you get friction establishing this eddy current. Now, if this particle leaves the fast-flowing water and enters this relatively slow-moving water, it enters this eddy and starts following the current around. It gets to this area here, doesn't stop because particles generally don't stop on solid surfaces. It then gets to this point where the current starts going up. And here we have something different happening. We have an action force, the impulse force wanting to move the particle up. We have a drag force from the fluid moving past the particle wanting to drag it on. But we've got a downward force from gravity. And the magnitude of that force is equal to the force of gravity multiplied by the total mass of the particle. The magnitude of the impulse forces wanting to move the particle up is proportional, in the case of the impulse force, the density of the water, the surface area that the impulse is contacting. What else? Density, impulse, surface area. Oh, velocity, the velocity of the current. The friction that's wanting to drag the particle up with it is dependent upon the surface area that is being dragged along by the flow, the roughness of the surface, the viscosity of the water, and those two forces are wanting to take the particle up. Now, I mentioned this briefly in the last video. Notice that I didn't mention density. And I want to cover that a little bit more here.
Oh, no, you don't. No, we're going to stop there. I hope you're able to digest this information. I hope that this helps to make sense of why I say so emphatically that pressure has nothing to do with where gold is deposited. In these examples, you can see that you can get gold co-located with what people have been calling a high pressure area.
Hey, you mean low pressure?
But also that this is the first example I've given of where there's another area which is close to the area that's traditionally dug, where you can find gold. Now, there's going to be more. And the more we go into this, the more we go into depth, the more we're going to find examples where the low pressure model can get you close to where the gold is, but sometimes you'll miss it because it's not close enough. Maybe you'll find it with good sampling technique. That's actually how I got onto some of this here. Some of the things that helped me to ask the questions I held. This doesn't make sense. It's not gelling with what I'm being taught. And I started going back to first principles of fluid dynamics, which I knew to sort of reassess what I was seeing as I was prospecting. In particular, finding significant numbers of pickers a long distance, or relatively long distance, from obstructions. There's a lot more to cover. There's a lot more to do. But we can go back into more of these videos, we can do more theory, but I reckon it's going to be more useful to me, more useful to you, if we just get back out to the river and start looking for gold for a while. And so I reckon for the next few videos, I'm just going to try and find some gold, particularly because I've been lent an SDC 2300 and I want to have a play with that because I don't have it for very long. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed. As always, if any of this didn't make sense, please ask away in the comments, ask the questions, because we're now putting a lot together. You know, some of the early videos were really, really simple, but now we've got to put all those simple things together at once to make better predictions of where to find the gold, where to put our shovel. So have fun, enjoy, And if you don't want to miss any of those videos as they're coming out, make sure you subscribe and hit that bell notification. See you in the creeks. Bye-bye.